I originally titled my talk, The Way That I Went, and it's going to be about some of my travels in the South Okanagan. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I came to that title and what I was thinking about. I'd come across a book by an Irish naturalist that was called The Way That I Went, or I'd read about it somewhere, and I thought that was an interesting title because I'd been casting around for a way that I could make a slideshow about some of the places I'd seen in the South Okanagan, and I thought I liked the sound of that title. So I knew this guy had written a book, so I went and got it out of the library. His name is Robert Prager, and what you have to notice here is the date the book was written. It's quite old, and he was a wandering botanist naturalist, apparently one of the first people to document the landscapes of Ireland in a scientific fashion, and he did this all by walking all over the country, and I thought, wow, that sounds great. This is my kind of guy. He just walked around looking at stuff, writing notes. I just walk around taking pictures, so we must be cut from the same cloth. So that's how I came up with the name, The Way That I Went. Now, when I started to put the slideshow together, I realized we need a bit of background here, so I'm going to start off telling you a little bit about the geological origins of the South Okanagan, the impact that glaciers have had, and then a bunch of other stuff here that is getting rather complicated, as you can see, and I'll say a bit more about that later, and then I'll show you a few places that I've been to. So without further ado, I hope you can see that there's Penticton. We're talking about a rather mountainous part of the world here called southern BC. And the area that I'm going to be dealing with today, I hope you can see that. It's just a black outline. It's pretty much from Summerland down to the border. You can't quite see the border because I think this picture was taken before we built the wall, but it's down that way anyways. And not too far east or west, Apex area over to the Okanagan mountainside. Not the best slide here, but what I wanted to show you was, this is what the world looks like now. It has these distinct continents there. I was having difficulty with that word for a minute, but they haven't always been in this arrangement. And what we want to look at is how they appeared back over in this time. This is where North America was situated, but it doesn't look much like it did then. In fact, it was part of a so-called supercontinent called Pangaea, and North America is right here. And even in this shape, it doesn't look quite like it does today, and there's a reason for that. All of these chunks of rock, the pieces of the crust that got pushed together and formed what's basically North America, were at that time missing all the mountains in BC. So this white stuff wasn't there when this existed. Look at the interesting names they have here too, eh? These are all northern explorers, people that live in the north. He was an aviation pioneer. I think that's really cool. Anyway, what happened was these other little bits of rock called terrains that were drifting around on the plates of the earth as well began to drift on shore, and they got stuck against that stuff that you saw in the previous picture and built up these mountains. So BC has been built up by the collision of a lot of small terrains against the side of the existing continental landmass. Somewhat, and here's the final result. We have all these different so-called terrains in BC. This is the continental mass of North America, and there's all these subsidiary chunks stuck onto BC. And that's why it looks so striated north-south. Here's a nice little analogy, a bulldozer pushing these little plates up against the Laurentian plate, and they eventually form mountains, and that's how the Rockies formed and the Coast Range and all that and everything in between. Now, a further complication, of course, and what we're going to see today and what we see in the South Okanagan is we've been glaciated in the history of the world at least 5 times, and in fact, we're still in a glacial epoch. We're just in a warm period. But we're working really hard at stopping that. We're going to get rid of this ice once and for all. There were 2 main sheets in the last ice age, the Laurentian sheet, which apparently originated from northern Quebec and in the Arctic and moved down this way. It's not very clear here, but there's a subdivision here, and this is called the Cordilleran ice sheet, which presumably formed in the mountains, both coastal and Rockies, and flowed into the valleys. Again, modifying the environment that we live in quite drastically and forming the landforms we see today. It was incredibly deep. If these are the coast mountains and the Rockies here, this ice covered pretty much everything. Now, just getting a little ahead of ourselves here, as it began to subside, I don't know if you get a chance to get into the mountains much yourself, the people here today, and to see how a glacier retreats. It doesn't go back upslope from where it came from. It sort of sinks down as well. So what happened in this process of so-called down-wasting is the central part began to disappear, and then it receded up the mountains. In any event, if you take, say, the peak of the coastal range being, say, 2,500 to 3,000 meters. Similarly for the Rockies, this whole area that we live in was covered with a huge amount of ice, possibly as deep as 2.5 kilometers where we live now. This is a little picture some of you might have seen I put into a talk about oxbows. I tried to envision what the Penticton area would look like with the ice down wasting. When I covered it all with white, you couldn't tell where Penticton was, so it wasn't very cool. But if you think of the ice as it's beginning to diminish and some of the peaks up here starting to show through, you know, there was nothing here but ice at one time. Really cool. I guess it was cold. This is the Greenland ice cap, and I imagine that Penticton looked much like that at one time, the whole South Okanagan. The one thing I wanted to show you from the next quick series of maps is the position of Okanagan Lake here. So at one time, the ice was still moving southward, and these lakes began to form. As the ice receded northwards, there was one very large lake called Lake Penticton that flowed north itself, and it went out through the Thompson system. So as our lake flows south now, it used to flow north, and that was partly due to an ice dam a little farther south of us, which is also of significance for our talk today. And the final picture here shows that the separation has occurred, so now we have basically Lake Penticton is becoming Lake Okanagan and the other subsidiary smaller lakes to the north. And the break between this and the Shuswap area has been complete. I don't know exactly what the dates were on this, but before my time. So once again, here's all the striations that have resulted from the creation of the landmass that we live on. And this picture, I wanted to point out these light brown areas. This is biologically quite significant. And I think that's what I'm going to come back to a little bit is these grasslands. Why they're so important has a lot of bearing on what's going to happen to us in the near future, too, as the climate continues to warm. This is one of my favorite pictures. We called this, when I was a biologist, the hourglass picture. Down here are the grasslands in central Washington. And this is where we live here, and there's a constriction point here, right approximately where McIntyre Bluff is, which you'll see some pictures of later on. Grasslands up in the Thompson, Okanagan area, and then farther up the Fraser Canyon and on into the Chilcotin. So this is the corridor through which animals and plants have moved as the ice retreated northwards. And this will be the corridor that continues to be important as organisms to the south and those living with us now adapt to a change in climate. So we happen to live in a pretty interesting area right here, predominantly grassland, and has filled a significant ecological role in the past and will continue to do so, provided we can manage it that way and we don't have total collapse with too many people here. At about this point in the preparation of the talk, which was now taken me about 3 weeks to get to the glaciology, I thought, okay, the climate, yeah, I can describe that pretty easily. It's fairly dry, we know that, except today. And although we get a relatively small amount of precipitation in the valley bottoms, it gets higher as you go up, but not a lot. It just gets colder, so it stays longer and it's drier. Then I thought, okay, I'm going to have to talk about soils now, but that was way beyond my ability, and I realized, okay, my protege, Prager, had been writing in 1937. There's got to be at least 2 orders of magnitude more information available today than there was in 1937. So although he may have described the soils and everything else below soils in a rather readable fashion, shall we say, it's probably relatively cursory in comparison to the level of knowledge we have today. So I kind of bailed out at soils. I don't understand soils, but needless to say, we have soils in the valley bottom and we have them up the hill. You all know that, so. The dominant vegetation types, too, are interesting, and people continue to classify and reclassify these. I used to think I knew what these were 30 years ago, but there's been a lot of advances in typing vegetation, which only academics, in my mind, would be trying to tell you about today. So we'll just get past that fairly quickly, too. I had to leave the soil map in, though. See, we've got brown soil here, darker brown soil here, and red stuff, okay? Upslope. So basically what we have, to be more serious, are grassland soils in the valley bottom and so-called forest soils upslope. Nothing that you wouldn't have been able to figure out for yourself. In the valley bottoms, we have predominantly ponderosa pine and bunch grass, and these are the species that are more or less dominant, the ones that are relatively easy to see. Upslope, there's never any clear demarcation between one zone and the other except on the map. And I've looked for these zones off and on as I've hiked, and you'll see pictures of today. They occur all over the place. But suffice it to say that as you get upslope, you see more Douglas fir and less ponderosa pine. Strange thing, eh? And on the mountaintops, you start to see species more typical of cooler environments. White pine, juniper, salmonberry you can see almost any place, bearberry all over the place. And we have a little bit of alpine in our area, but not very much. I'll show you, I have most of my pictures, I think, are from the alpine. So you'll see later what's available there, or what's to be seen. These were the broad areas I thought I would show you slides on today. We'll see if we get through all of them. I'm through with all the technical stuff, but for the sake of the test, just keep in mind that there will be questions about the geology, the glaciology, the climate, and the soils. I won't be marking the test because I don't understand that stuff anymore. Apex area. Now, I said there'd be some pictures of sun, and clearly that's a clear day, but it isn't summer. Apex is an interesting place to go at any time of the year. This is Beaconsfield, the top of the ski hill here. I find it quite interesting to go around looking at plants, taking pictures of them, taking pictures why I never really know, but they're nice to take pictures of, and trying to remember the names. And I found that botany, I was an ornithologist as a professional, I found botany to be a very interesting hobby because at my age, it's new every year. I have to relearn the plant names every spring. So it's like I start afresh. In any event, I should probably try and tell you something about the geology of this area to keep in mind all the things I've told you about. But I can't think of what type of rock this is, except it's hard. Mostly on the west side of the Okanagan Valley, it's volcanic origin, and on the east side, it's igneous. So there is a fault zone that runs right through the big lakes, the Okanagan Lake and Skaha Lake and south, that separates these two land masses. So although the plant variation is not as noticeable, the landforms certainly are different east and west of the lakes. I think we tend as hikers to spend more time on the west side for some reason, so I have a bit more familiarity with it. This is the southeast ridge of Apex Mountain. We're standing on Apex proper to take this picture, and this is Green Mountain. So now for a bunch more pretty pictures. It's very easy to get Tony-only pictures when you're out in the mountains here. There's always bands of mountains in the distance have a different color on them. I find these quite intriguing. Sometimes you can capture the clouds well as a case in point too. Here's another nice one, but with this ugly big rock that looks like it's going to fall on you. This is evidence of glaciation. All throughout the area around Apex and in the bush, you can find very large rocks called erratics that have not come from anything higher. They've been dropped by the ice. Oh, here's a nice winter shot. Sunny, but cool. That's the same ridge that was pictured in the two previous. There's a large erratic, and just take it from me that over here there's nothing above this rock. So the question is, if you don't understand geology and glaciology, how did it get there? Well, as I mentioned, the depth of the ice was phenomenal here, and as it moved along, rocks could have fallen on the ice or been picked up by it, and they've been transported all over the countryside. And everywhere you go in the bush up in the Apex Plateau, you can find these large erratics. There's a particularly interesting one here. It's got a fir tree growing out of it. You can see the roots coming right down through here. Can't tell from this picture whether this is actually split right in half or exactly. It's open to your imagination as to how the tree started to grow there, but eventually it probably will split the rock simply by its expanding growth there, but kind of an interesting place to grow. And this is definitely an erratic. There's nothing else around it. It's been worked by ice and water. It's rounded off. There's nowhere it could have fallen from. Whilst we're in the alpine, you're going to see a few alpine pictures. You can see all manner of alpine species in the apex area at different times of the year. They do tend to dry out quickly, so you have to be there in spring and early summer. These are the silky lupins. You'll see a fair number of these. I get chastised for taking too many pictures of the common paintbrush, but they are very picturesque, I find. This is the red columbine. You can find these in other areas as well, but what you're being inflicted with now is just a lot of pictures that I've taken that I find quite attractive of the flowers in the area. It is the white bog orchid. We have several, maybe half a dozen orchid species in our area, and this is one that's relatively easy to see. It grows about maybe 2 feet, 3 feet high, and these small white flowers are in fact the individual orchid flowers. Sometimes it grows in profusion, but not close together, so once you spot it, you'll start seeing all kinds of them. There are many other interesting features on the landscape. This is, I think, an old spruce tree that's been down for some time, and they form these skeletons that you find all over the place in the alpine, mainly because the alpine is somewhat open. It's a parkland environment. These dead trees do the same thing in the forest, but they're not quite as picturesque. It's a four-season area, in my view, Apex Mountain. This was one of our snowshoeing trips up there. It can get a little cool. This is the southwestern ridge of Apex here. So I'm on the top of Apex looking towards Nickel Plate here. Heavy drifts of snow along this side. This is the bowl down here, the Apex Bowl. The light is always quite interesting to play with in this area and in many other spots. If you're up there at the right time, you get to some good shots. Here's a picture from the top of Apex I'm quite proud of. Several of us had an argument a few times in the past about which peaks you could actually see from various places in the Okanagan. And I'd taken this picture and when I got home, I looked at it more closely and I realized you can actually see some of the Cascade volcanoes. This is Mount Baker right here. It's one of the few places you can see it. This is from the top of Apex. This here is the top of Mount Rainier, about 1/3 of the top of it poking up. You don't have to believe me, but I'm pretty sure that's what they are. And just in the corner here is Glacier Peak, which is almost due south of us. It's not as well defined in this picture, but it's interesting what you can see from up there. In the summertime, you can see the results of, I forgot to mention, it's often very windy up on Apex at all times of the year, and particularly in the winter when it's blowing up there, it's very cold. I had a group of snowshoers up there once a couple of years back, and two of the women with me were very lightly built, and we got into a very strong windstorm, and I was afraid one of them was going to get blown off the hill. It just blew up so quickly, and I had to grab onto her. I don't think she was in any danger of being blown off the hill, but it looked like she might lose her balance, so I grabbed her. But anyways, the net result of all this wind is a relatively barren environment up there. It's just blowing everything off of it. I don't imagine the snowmobilers help much either, but everything that's growing up there is close to the ground. These are white bark pine, and you can often see these growing fairly close to the ground in that environment. You often see them standing, as you saw that picture of that spruce down, they'll be standing still with many dead limbs on them. They have a different form than other pine. They tend to be more branching, but they've suffered badly in the last 40 or 50 years from some form of rust. And many of the older trees in the alpine are long gone, but it's good to see the small ones coming back because that means they've like the other pine trees, they've survived the various blights that have come their way. I think this is trapper's tea, not to be confused with Labrador tea. Only trappers drink this. Labrador tea is used by labs and people that come from Labrador. They have to know this stuff. I was hoping my former work colleague from Kelowna would be here. He's a very good plant man. He would have been able to tell us for sure if I'm lying or not. A species of buttercup. We often see buttercups at many places in our rambles, but they are harbingers of spring. They're the first flowers that we generally see. A marsh marigold. I hope you like pictures of flowers. Pink mountain heather, that grows in fair profusion in the apex area out in the alpine and on Sheep Rock and Brent Mountain. Doesn't seem to last very long here, so it's quite spectacular when it's out. If I was a hunter, I would say I was a jump shooter in that I don't sit in blinds waiting for things to come to me. I'm not sure the term for photography. Opportunistic, that's probably it. I carry a long lens with me, but I don't really have the patience to sit there and wait for the birds to come to me, but occasionally you get lucky, and this is a pine grosbeak, immature, I believe. So sometimes the young of the year are a lot easier to take pictures of because they're not quite as bright as the older birds. Here's something that's of interest. This is in the Sheep Rock area, and Sheep Rock, by and large, is alpine or subalpine. These trees are rather more dense here in this picture than they are throughout the Sheep Rock area. But there are two places where you can see these large boulder fields. Now, these have been worked by water, but there isn't any kind of water up there that's large enough to have moved rocks that size recently. So what I conclude is that at some point when the ice was melting, there was a huge torrent of water through this area. And this is basically an old stream bed. There's a couple of other places you can see this in that area. Fascinating to think of the forces that were at play in those days when the rest of the valley was full of ice, and this was pretty much where meltwater occurred. There's another series of ponds in this area that are very pretty. These are probably erratics as well, quite large rocks, and I'm sure these ponds are left over from some large movement of water at some time, and the soils have developed around them, and they're just really pretty in the springtime. Spruce grouse. These aren't the smartest birds in the forest, so they can be relatively easy to take pictures of too. This is a lupin with either rain or dew on it. I don't know if you can see in the picture, but the lupin plant, when it first comes out, is very hairy. And this is an adaptation that a lot of plants in the alpine have for this reason. It helps them trap water, and it funnels it down onto the stem, which will lead it to the bottom of the plant. So this is an adaptation for an area that is relatively dry. They're able to conserve any water that comes their way. One of the other early flowers to come out, and also grows in profusion in my front lawn, this is the blue violet. We have 3 or 4 varieties of violet in this area. I find these quite pretty. I'm not real keen on them in my lawn, but they're very nice out in the wild. Buttercups again. Moss campion, these are very typical alpine plants. We don't have a lot of these around here, but they're very pretty too. Not a moss, they're a vascular plant that looks like a moss, and a small pink flower. This is, it's a Jacob's ladder. You see the leaves here that look sort of ladder-like? If anybody has a better idea what these are, they can tell me. Another one of the violets, this is the round-leafed violet. I guess you can see the leaves there. Yeah, that's a round leaf, isn't it? And the small blue or small penstemon, I just forget which is the actual name. And these are spring flowers predominantly. White geranium. Now we're back in winter. Spruce grouse female. I'd flushed this out of a snowbank. She's trying to make out that she's a ptarmigan, but the colors don't work too well. Clark's nutcracker. Quick story about nutcrackers. When I was young, anytime we were in the bush, the bird that we saw most often was the gray or Canada jay. And the Clark's nutcracker I thought was relatively uncommon. I don't think I saw one until I was in my 20s. It seems to be the other way around now. The Clark's nutcracker is very common in this area, and the gray jay seems to be less so. Okay, moving on a little bit. McIntyre Bluff, I mentioned that Proto Lake Penticton was flowed north, and the actual site of the end of the lake was most likely a large ice dam between this area and this area. This is McIntyre Bluff, and I'm standing on Eagle Bluff. This is the Highway 97 going south here. Here's a couple of aerial views, thanks to Google Earth, to show this a bit more clearly. This is the McIntyre Bluff. Look at how that's been scoured there. And Eagle Bluff here. There's also some other interesting land features. This flat land probably is the fan of McIntyre Creek. And you can see some old beach lines here somewhere. Just let me back up a minute. Right along the edge here, you can see what's probably high water at one time. So clearly there was something very large in this area that would have allowed a beach line up this high. Another angle on this. This is taken from over top of the new prison. I wasn't actually in it. So that's Eagle Bluff on the east side of the mountain, or the valley. And the normal trail on this is up around this side and onto the top. I don't think any of our group has tried the front yet, but you never know. This is an area where we see more dryland plants. This is the flower of the antelope brush. There's also a lot of interesting rock features in the Eagle Bluff area. This is probably tumbled off the hillside here. See, it's all very sharp, straight-sided, so it's not been water worked or ice managed. That's one of my hiking friends stuck in the middle there. I don't know, he might still be there. We'll get him next spring. See the little flowers up here? Those are the shrubby penstemon, which are in profusion there in the springtime. Very pretty area. This is balsam root. I've been known to take a lot of balsam root pictures too. In fact, one of my hiking buddies asked me if there were any balsam roots I hadn't photographed yet, and he would be glad to point them out if he found them. This is a good spot for balsam root. Chocolate lily. Here's an interesting plant. This is known as broom rape. It's a parasitic plant, parasitic on alum root and another species of plant, which might come back to me in a minute. This is the first time I've seen this in my 10 or 12 years of hiking in this area. It has no leaves, just a long stalk and a very pretty flower, so it's gathering all of its nutrients at the expense of the plant it lives on. And in this case, it was alum root, a type of saxifrage. This is McIntyre Creek in springtime, quite a torrent, something you wouldn't want to go into. But in late summer, it's a really cool place to hike, and you can get all the way up, well, a long ways up. We go to a certain point and then clamber out. The best time to do this is when the air temperature in the valley is about 35, because it's only about 25 in the canyon, and the water is nice and warm. You make your way up the canyon, dancing over the rocks, going through the rock pools. Nice and cool. You have to be a little cautious on the rocks. There's one spot where you have to swim. You could maybe climb around this. There's two other spots that you have to climb around, so it's not to be taken lightly, but this is a cool dip right through here. And a little bit of current there, so it's kind of a thrill. But at some point, you got to come to your senses and you have to clamber back out of it. And it usually goes from, like I say, 25 in the bottom to 35 at the top, and you kind of wonder, well, why didn't we do it the other way around? Because now we have to struggle back in the heat to get home. When we came back out on that last hike, we ended up at SORCO, the South Okanagan. What does it stand for, Dave? Right, where the rehab center, and these beasties are known to habitate some of their buildings at times, and Dale, the manager there, had found this one inside one of the facilities, so I took the opportunity to photograph it. This is the Pacific rattlesnake. I've only seen two in the wild. I don't know that they're very common anymore, but we certainly don't encounter them at any kind of frequency, but they're kind of neat. The dipper was pictured up in the canyon, relatively tame there. I think we must have been close to a nest that had gotten her a little excited. And the ever-present turkey vulture waiting for us to make a slip so it could have dinner. Going a little farther south now, Richter Pass on Highway 3B, I guess it is, between Karamias and Osoyoos. I have a number of pictures from different sides of the road here. This is down towards Kilpoola Lake. This is all silky, whatever it is, the blue flower. See, it's coming close to spring, so now I have to relearn them. Lupins, there we go. The Cathedral Mountains, this might be snowy. I'm not sure from where we're standing, but some spectacular views some days there. This is sulfur buckwheat. Does anybody know the name of this butterfly? If you do, you can tell me later. I wasn't able to figure it out myself. They're not easy to take pictures of either. They seem to be quite wary of cameras. It may be the very large eye staring at them. The road is just down in the valley here. This was one of the clearest days I've seen there. Kilpoola Lake, we visited this late last summer, early fall. And this was a very unusual spring last year. Well, you can well remember it, how wet and cold it was. But what it did was recharge all the ponds. This is so high this year that the normal walk route is that there used to be a road on the far side here, completely underwater at the end of the season. So this last spring was very good for all the small ponds, recharged them up. Many different flowers to be seen in that area, as elsewhere. This is shooting star. Stands of aspen. Now, I have a particular thing for aspens. If you know the author or the artist Bev Doolittle, she's painted some very interesting pictures of pinto horses in aspens. And she's painted them in such a fashion that you can barely see them, but when you look closely, they're definitely there. So I like to try and find these aspen stands and have my hiking friends hide behind them. So they're not actually horses, but they're hikers. I don't think you can see the hikers there, can you? If you can think of the last picture, the aspen were probably a foot through. I didn't bother to take pictures there. So I was thinking, well, there'll be bigger stands farther along the trail. No, they got worse. So these are about the smallest aspens you could possibly stand behind. Blue-eyed Mary, I think that is, and a bumblebee. It's this area south and around Kilpoola is quite steep. It's also been burned over a couple of times, and this is the property that the Nature Conservancy owns now. They call the Sage and Sparrow. Goes right down to the border. We get quite a laugh out about looking out over the border and seeing if the American helicopters will show up to see how close we are. It's not actually found in the Kilpoola area. I found this over by Cobo Mountain. It's called horse leaf nettle. And it is a nettle. You can see it's got square leaves. But the flower itself is probably almost a foot tall. It's very pretty. So there's all kinds of different variation in these areas that we get to, even though they're, as I was hoping to show you earlier, we can classify these areas as, for example, ponderosa pine or Douglas fir forests predominantly, but there's many different plant communities that grow within these areas. And so anytime I'm out, I always find something new to take a picture of. Mount Baldy, we are definitely jumping around here. This is another very pretty spot, and I can tell you why that is. This is the ski area, so we're looking north here. This is another Google photo. And this is to the south. You can see that it's all quite open and rocky on the top of Baldy if you haven't been there. There's also fissures north and south on these in this rocky area. So what I'm thinking this is most likely a fault zone, but these also collect a fair amount of snow in the wintertime, and in the spring and summer they remain quite moist. So they're just absolutely chock full of alpine flowers at times, whereas everything else around is relatively barren. There's not too much growing directly on the rock. Oh, look at another one of those. Common paintbrush. Lupins with a nice black background and some kind of yellow flower there, probably an Agoceras. Some large spruce trees in that area. There's a hiker down there, some guy trying to hold that up. I guess these have just died of old age. There's no evidence of a large bug kill down there, but there's lots of, not lots, but significant numbers of large standing dead trees. We call these totems when they appear that way. They're quite picturesque in my mind. Pink monkey flower. Lots of common juniper, the one that grows very close to the ground. Believe it or not, this one's still alive. You can just see a little bit of green there. Quite picturesque. There's one field that they ski on, not a field, I guess, it's a slope, that was absolutely covered in this orchid, the whatever it was I said earlier. I've forgotten. Oh, bog orchid. There we go. More lupins and a nice big, probably an erratic in the background. Red and yellow flowers. Sandwort, this is called, a low-growing plant with very thin leaves and quite a pretty white flower. Now, jumping north a bit, Okanagan Mountain and area. The pictures I have to show you here go from Okanagan Mountain down to approximately the climbing bluffs in the Skaha Lake area. So it's not technically Okanagan Mountain, it's sort of the east side. And as I mentioned earlier, this is much harder rock on this side than it is on the west side. And as you know, this area in Okanagan Mountain Park was badly burned in 2003. Tree growth is rather slow coming back, but you can see some places where there's enough moisture, it's returned. But on occasion, the wildflowers are absolutely spectacular. This last spring seemed to be the year for lupins. They were just everywhere and growing very tall as well. There's quite a variety in color in this species of lupin. Here's a very light blue, and they even show up as pink. They're the same species, the silky lupin. There are other species that are quite white, sulfur lupins, but they're not seen generally together. And this area on Okanagan Mountain has great abundance of lupins this year. Did I say there were a lot of lupins? Slowly but surely, the trees are coming back, though. There's a young fir tree there and lots of aspen. But the fire was so hot, it burned off most of the humus, so it's right down to bare rock now. Spring beauty. This is another type of orchid called the spotted coral root. Spotted because it has spots on the very small flowers. I've only seen this in one location, and that was on the lower trail on Okanagan Mountain. Occasionally I get lucky with a bird that's as hard to see as it is to picture as this, the rufous hummingbird. This is a female or possibly an immature bird. Again, my experience is the immatures are much less wary of cameras than the adults. Spotted towhees, you can usually find those around. I was lucky to catch the picture of this. It's a yellow-bellied sapsucker that was cleaning out its nest, and I just happened to see it out of the corner of my eye pop out of this tree, so I watched to see what it was doing, and it was excavating the innards of this tree, which I think was quite punky, and it would come out with great mouths full of rotten tree, and it would look around very carefully, and it would fly a considerable distance away before it dropped the sawdust, so there was no clue that to anything coming along the ground that there was any reason to look upwards for a snack. This is a lady slipper orchid. Quite a few places we can find that. Doesn't last long in the spring. It absolutely doesn't survive if you pick it. This is a honeysuckle, a vine type honeysuckle. Anybody know what that bug is? It's a large beetle of some kind. A black beetle, yeah, that's good enough for me. Yeah, so I often see insects that I haven't got any clue as to what they are. This is a rose with another species of bee on it that I haven't seen before. Many of these are probably solitary. They're certainly not honeybees that you see, domesticated honeybees. They're wild bees. The blue-bead lily, or queen's cup. I saw this last spring on Okanagan Mountain. I don't know of any other place that I've seen it. It's fairly common on the coast. I guess it must like fairly moist areas. Here's that broom rape again, and the species that it's parasitizing here is the alum root. You can't see the picture, the flowers very well of the alum root because they're not in focus, but that's the leaf there. And this species is living off the roots on that. So twice in 1 year I've seen a species that I've never encountered for the 10 or 12 years I've been hiking here. This I believe to be a rock wren, and another picture I had, which I didn't bring with me, it had an insect in its mouth, so that's indicative of breeding. That doesn't look like a rock it's standing on, however. Anybody know that butterfly? A black and white one with red tips. That must be another paintbrush. The species of chipmunk is northwestern. How's that, eh? Sometimes easy to photograph, usually not. This is over towards the climbing bluffs now. There's a couple of little ponds that we ride by, and in the spring you can find some interesting birds in there. This is the hooded merganser drake. And this is a type of swallowtail known as the pale swallowtail. I don't know why pale, because it's got black parts on it. Swallowtails, the orange ones we get in the backyard quite frequently. Not to be confused with monarchs, which do occur in this area, but are quite rare. Columbine, thank you. These pictures I took just a few weeks back. We were going up just a little bit north of the climbing bluffs into an area that I call Charcoal Mountain. It became charcoal in the fire in the 90s that went through there. It's a very pretty area in the fall now. This is, I don't know what species of tree this is, probably an aspen of just in its prime yellow colors. That was a beautiful day with all the cloud formations like that. And looking, this is Okanagan Mountain here, so it's a nice view up the, just imagine all the ice that was in here at one time. Eh? These are the larch that we went to have a look at, and I found that I had the same picture of this rock the previous year, but we didn't see too many, we didn't see too much of anything that year. You want to see the other one again? Trust me, it's the same rock. Yeah, a very pretty place to go in the fall, but quite rugged. Again, this is the hard side of the valley. The rock is very broken and difficult walking, shall we say, in this area. Parker Mountain and Twin Lakes. This is the Parker Mountain massif right here. This is actually White Lake. Another interesting place to hike. This is Horn Lake. Twin Lakes are actually back here. And the Twin Lakes, most of the time, are just one lake. There's this little subdivision between them, an isthmus, I guess, that on occasion, when the water's low, there are twin lakes. But the bigger lake here is Horn Lake. Interestingly, White Lake Basin back here, this water all flowed out this way just after the ice left. Now it flows the other way towards Yellow Lake, which would be off the picture over here. This is the east end of Parker Mountain. Some interesting hiking to be had up there. That's a dark phase redtail. Anybody know the name of this? It's pink twink. It's a very small flower, probably no more than 1/4 of an inch across, and it's quite common in the spring, and often in the Penticton area, a second blooming when it starts to get damp again in the fall after the dry summer. But it's also one of the first flowers out. Quite unobtrusive, but it's very abundant. So once you see it, you'll realize how widespread it is. More balsam root. Well, lots of balsam root on this, on Parker Mountain. This hillside was just absolutely covered in it the year we were up there. You can sort of see it in the green. It's not quite so green there. That's because it's yellow. There are other yellow colors to be had, and that's in the fall. These are aspens here. Looking towards White Lake Basin. It's the White Lake Ranch here. We happened to be lucky enough to get a picture of a horned owl just about 6 or 8 weeks back hiking up there. I don't know if you can see it very clearly, but look at the size of the claws on this thing. You wouldn't want to be in the grasp of that beast. Climatic conditions when the fog or the cloud is coming and going make for interesting pictures, and you can often lose your party. These are hikers. These are not. The road or the trail we were on was right here. These are the two range bulls. We saw no other cows up there that day, and they weren't getting off that trail. They were these are a relatively docile breed, these Angus, so we weren't too worried about them, but we didn't test them. We walked well around them. First thing I thought, of course, was a bear. Looking south off of the top of the west hump of Parker, you can just make out the cathedrals back here. But this is the sort of conditions that make for very interesting pictures. Earlier in the spring on Horn Lake, there'd been a winter kill of a carp, which is not a bad thing, and it had been really a boon for the eagles. We must have seen 15 or 20 eagles in there in the spring. It's just a morning picture towards White Lake. There's some interesting geology on the side of, this is now just above Twin Lakes. You can see this looks like karst formation almost. Karst is normally limestone that's been eroded by water, and you get caves and caverns forming in it. But this turns out to be some kind of volcanic dust called tuff. And it's compacted down quite well, so it's like concrete basically, but it is prone to erosion. And this has all kinds of fissures and caves throughout. You can see a bit better one here. Quite interesting. I don't know of any other area that's where that's found. Parker is a good place to go in the winter as well, or the spring. This picture was taken. You get some nice contrast here. Another tree that didn't make it, but it makes for a nice picture. Mahoney Lake area, I don't know if you know the history of Mahoney Lake, but it has no outlet. So the water that drains into it stays there and only leaves by evaporation. It has a peculiar strata to it because it's in a hollow. It's not prone to turnover in the spring, like when the winds pick up. Normally the bigger lakes, we have what's called a turnover each spring. The colder water from the surface is mixed with warmer surface, or colder water from the depth is mixed with surface water, usually by the wind, causing a mixing and a transfer of nutrients throughout the water column. This doesn't happen here, and what's happened is at about a meter or so down, there's a layer of bacteria growing, sulfur-loving, I think they are, because there's a pretty strong smell can come out of this lake at certain times. And below that is completely anoxic, so it never gets mixed up. You get a fair number of different bird species on the top layer, but I can conclude that whatever is living below is adapted to a very harsh environment in that there's no oxygen there. There's a story about this. Do you know what this plant is? It's really pretty in the fall and has really pretty white berries, but it's poison ivy. And how do I know that? Because I fell into a patch of it earlier this year. So I should have known that just because it's a pretty red plant and worthy of a picture, that it's not something that you want to pick up and bring home. I did that once with a sprig of berries. I didn't know what they were, and my wife and I were out for a walk, and I clipped these things off and couldn't think of what these white berries were on this very interesting twiggy tree. Threw them in the trunk, and about halfway home it dawned on me. So I picked them up with a plastic bag when we got home and never touched them. Fortunately, didn't get any of the resin on my hands, but I don't know how I avoided that. It's quite nasty when you get into it. Another dark-phased redtail in the Mahoney Lake area. The white-breasted nuthatch, two of them, probably the same one. And also, this is the yarrow, I think it is, or yes, yarrow as it's senescing. The red-breasted nuthatch. I got both of these nuthatches pictures on the same day. I've never actually seen them together like that, but in fall migration, this picture I took because I liked the bill on this mallard. It's still in its, just coming out of its eclipse. You know, the waterfowl go through a body eclipse after the middle of summer, And for all the ducks that have distinctive male and female, they all look like female birds for a certain time, and then they start to molt back into their breeding plumage. Little muskrat, some kind of yellow flower. This is a little lake in the on the side of Hawthorne, and my friend, I don't know what he was looking at, but it was a nice, pretty picture. This is the lake, believe it or not. It's completely calm there. You're going to see that again in a minute, and there's going to be a test that goes with it. Crested wheatgrass and hikers. See, these are hikers here. This is evidence of the volcanic nature of the landscape over in that area, and that some idiot is standing on the top of it. Why he would do that, I have no idea. Parker Mountain with the snow on it. This is that lake that I showed you before, and that's the background. It's not the best picture, but I thought that was an interesting, see the symmetry in it? That is probably not an erratic from its shape, but because it's not water-worn at all. One of my friends thought he might try and push it over. Fortunately, it didn't go. Rock paintings, we have quite a few places where you can find those around here. This is down at Vassal Lake now. We're still in the same sort of area, Mahoney Lake, but just a little bit lower. A trumpeter swan, notice that the bill almost merges with the eye. That's a good way to differentiate them. A tundra swan, the eye is distinct from the bill. It also usually has a yellow spot there. I just thought I'd throw that in. Another one of those grouse birds. White Lake, one of my favorite places for a walk and to take pictures. I'll get through this as quickly as I can here. I mentioned earlier that we have another species of lupin that is sort of white. It's called sulfur lupin. This is an entire hill of it just near White Lake a couple of springs ago. That's the White Lake Basin there. This also is the early blue violet, but a very pale color. Does anybody know this one? It's a lily called Trintelia, I think it is the name. It was in profusion 2 springs ago in White Lake, and not a one to be found this year. I don't think it does well with grazing, but so since they rotate grazing there every 2 years, next year might be a good year for it. This I believe to be what used to be called a Harlan's hawk. It's a very dark phase red tail. It has no white on it at all. And it was quite conducive to having his picture taken that morning, but not for long. You forgot to pick up the Cheerios. Type of larkspur. I think this is a different species. It's quite a different color and a much larger flower. They seem to co-occur, so it could be just a color phase or a subspecies. The western painted turtle, sage sparrow, ruddy duck. You can see all of this stuff in the White Lake area, not in the lake, but in the surrounding areas. A waxwing, I'm never sure of which type, Bohemian or cedar. I've only ever seen this once, but lots of bear sign in that country. You talking about bears? Yellow rump warbler. Some more yellow flowers, a pair of kestrels. They didn't know I was looking down on them. They're hard to take photos of. So is this bird. And they're also hard to locate. I think they're completely ventriloquial. They can make a sound that you cannot figure out where it is. I don't know how they find each other. But sometimes you get lucky. This is the western bluebird. Bitterroot, thank you. Northern shrike, that was a nice picture to get. These are cranes, I think they're going north. These are the same cranes going south. Mountain bluebird. White-throated swift, it took me about a half an hour to get pictures of these lying on the ground with the camera pointed up. They are so fast that it's just complete luck that you get them in the frame. It must have been a cool day there. That one's nicely fluffed up. Well, it wasn't that cold. But any time of the year you go to White Lake, there's things to take pictures of. Even at night. The Milky Way. Yeah, these pictures were taken just by OK Falls. Barrow's goldeneye seem to hang out there in the late fall, early winter. And I'll leave it at that.